It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Keith Fox, who is my colleague. Keith is the Associate Director of the Faraday Institute, and he has two jobs because he works for us at the Faraday Institute, but he's also a professor at the University of Southampton. In fact, Professor of Biochemistry there. And he's got a long and prestigious academic track record, some of which was spent here in this great University of Cambridge. But perhaps most importantly, at the moment, he is the Senior Executive Editor of a very prestigious journal in his field called Nucleic Acids Research. He's worked a lot on DNA, and he's going to talk to us this afternoon in our continuing theme of origins on the subject of evolutionary genetics and human evolution. So Keith, hand over to you.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As Hugh said, my subject area is DNA. I'm a DNA biochemist, really, and I'm daring to talk about evolution and about genetics. At the risk of seeming blindingly obvious, why is this a big question? And I think it comes at two different levels. One is the personal one, which says, really, where do I come from? And you know things about your ancestry. Many of you may have traced your family trees. How many of you have actually subscribed to one of these genome sequencing things, 23andMe or Ancestry.com? I'm surprised how few have actually, given the number of people. You can say something about not just the diseases that you might be carrying, but your ancestry, where you might have originated from. So that's one of the big questions. The other one is rather, what does it mean to be human? And are we different? I hope you can tell somehow the difference between that photo of me taken as it might have been 10 or 15 years ago and the chimpanzee. So where we're going this afternoon, I want to take us, if we get there, through something. I'm picking up what Hugh was saying earlier on the origin of life, something about evolution and genes and genomics and what we know about that, some Christian responses to evolution, to focus then on human evolution, and then take us through what that might mean in terms of being made in the image of God and who was Adam, and then if we really have time, something on chance, which picks up, again, some things that Hugh had at the end of his talk. One thing that was raised indirectly was actually the question of what is life? And you can look in the textbooks, and there's probably a dozen different definitions of what life is. And here's a few of them. Is it self-reproduction with variations? Is it self-sustaining chemical systems capable of Darwinian evolution? Or some have said it's an entity with the ability to adapt to its environment. What is life? You can get things that self-replicate. RNA, you might come back to talking about the RNA world. You can make bits of RNA that self-replicate. They make new copies of themselves, as RNA itself is a sort of proto-enzyme. Is that self-sustaining activity life? And I put the word mule on there because you know what a mule is, and you'll agree that that's alive, yes? But a mule can't replicate. It's sterile. But yet each of the cells within the mule obviously do replicate. So the question of what life is may underlie some of the things we're talking about. Let me give you my view of evolution, evolutionary history at a glance. If we've got something about 3.8 billion years ago, and I've put the noughts on just to make it clear what we're talking about. It is a long time. 3.8 billion years ago, replicating molecules first appeared, and that roughly agrees with what Hugh was saying later. Maybe 3.5 million years ago, some form of unicellular life. Debatable as to where eukaryotes, that's more complicated unicellular life. They have within them organelles. They have a nucleus that separate. They have other things like mitochondria. Chloroplasts come a little bit later with plants. And that's probably the first example of cooperation in evolution. where endosymbiosis is that a primitive bacterium was engulfed within another one, which subsequently became the mitochondria or the chloroplast or the cellular organelle. And then we'll leap ahead in terms of what I want to look at. Something like 500 million years ago, a bit more than that, was the Cambrian explosion, where multicellular organisms seemed to take off in abundance. It's worth pointing out, though, as we go through evolutionary time, there were a number of extinctions, and the greatest of them all is supposed to have been about 250 million years ago of the Permian extinction, when 90% of all life on this planet, at least 90%, becomes extinct. Whether that was another asteroid collision, who knows? Obviously, the famous ones are the dinosaurs, of roughly 225 million, the extinction of the dinosaurs, 65 million, hominids of some kind appearing about 4 million years ago, and we're just a footnote in evolutionary history of about 150,000 years ago. Modern Homo sapiens begins to appear on the scene. How does life originate? Basically, my answer to the question that's posed to Hugh is we don't know. There's lots of ideas, whether it is hydrothermal vents, the building blocks of life, they may have come from outer space, who knows? There is, I think, no really good hypothesis, but I think we need to be very careful. That does not necessarily mean that God's supernatural activity is the only explanation of where life came from. It didn't necessarily need a divine intervention. Whether origin of life was natural or supernatural, and maybe we erroneously did put a break between those two, it was of God. And there's nothing, though, to be lost as a scientist by attempting to investigate how that happened through scientific methods. And then ask the question as to how far does God's reproducible, regular activity affect life and the transition from non-life to life. And maybe the whole cosmos is constructed in such a way it's inevitable that life, and ultimately intelligent life, is what we're talking about in humans, we'll assume it's intelligent, but that actually came to be. There is the question, of course, what comes first? DNA makes protein, and you need protein to make DNA. So we've got a sort of chicken and egg cycle in that. RNA is probably the intermediary within that. RNA, we know, has some catalytic activity. It can do many of the things that some proteins do. It has obviously the same properties of DNA. So maybe the RNA world, but I think there's actually a bigger question as well. Was it the chicken or the egg or the hen house? You've actually got to put that within the context of a lipid environment. But we do know that lipids will self-assemble to make cellular-like structures just in aqueous environments. And it's worth remembering, too, that early life was probably incredibly inefficient. We're used to enzymes, that's the things that speed up chemical reactions, those biological catalysts that maybe increase rates of reaction by 10 to the 8-fold, so 100 million-fold rate enhancement. And compared to something that speeds it up twofold, that's pretty pathetic. But twofold is better than nothing. So early life may have been very, very inefficient. Did it happen more than once? Probably not. We know that the genetic code is constant throughout the whole of biology as we know it, which rather suggests that it did only happen once, or if it happened more than once, only one form of the genetic code has survived. Which brings us to natural selection. What is it? We're familiar with the phrase, I'm sure. Organisms all have individual variations that are fully transmitted from parent to offspring. All organisms produce more offspring than required to replace the next generation. There's a limited amount of resources, so if you like, there's a struggle for existence. The things that are best fitted to their environment are more likely to be carried across into the next generation. Those are the ones that survive because they're best suited. So you get a selection according to the ones that have the right genes. So it's what's called descent with modification, gradual change over long periods of time. And that makes things look as though they're designed for the environment that they're found in. is actually that they've been selected according to that environment. And that shaped the whole of the biological world that we see around us. Just to make sure that we're on board with some of the phrases you might come across, the neo-Darwinian synthesis is one of the fancy phrases that's used, and the modern evolutionary synthesis. That simply is a combination of the things that we know about genetics, about molecular biology, with some of the ideas, the original ideas for Darwin, bringing those all together into one coherent model. Because actually we should see Darwin had really no explanation for evolution. If you're asked the man or woman in the street what the evidence for evolution is, I think most people would probably say fossils. Fossils actually play, I think, a fairly small part of that. They were a very small part of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, where he looked at observations of variations in nature, selective breeding of doves, etc., and comparing anatomical developmental similarities between organisms. Fossils are important, but don't over-egg what they do. Whoops. Come back. There have been a lot, though, of scientific developments since Darwin. As I say, he proposed the natural selection, but he had no mechanism for how that could happen. And now the whole evolutionary theory is backed up by so much now in genetics and genomics and DNA evidence that underpins and actually corroborates lots of the things that we've known previously before all the DNA technologies came in to force. I'm conscious that people here are coming from a variety of backgrounds, scientists, non-scientists, physicists, biologists. Let's get a few definitions out the way. One is a gene. Well, I'll give you a simple definition. It's a region of DNA that codes for a protein. And that piece of DNA can be as short as 1,000 of these bases, A, G, C, and T, the alphabet of DNA, or they can be as long as 1 million. But they code for a protein. That's a very simple definition of it. And each of those genes is arranged along each chromosome. So a chromosome contains many genes. And we have 23 chromosomes, 2 copies of each one, 46 in total, with about 20,000 genes arranged across those chromosomes. In terms of the A, G, C, and T, our sequence, we have about 3 billion base pairs of those letters that make up our genome. And every cell in your body contains exactly the same sequence. It's different from the person next to you, probably by about 1 in every 1,000 of those letters, but it's unique to you, and it's the same in every cell in your body. The reason why those cells are different is that some genes are switched on in some tissues and switched off in other ones, so that the proteins expressed in your brain are different from the proteins expressed in your big toe. At least we'll assume that's the case. DNA is a fascinating molecule. As I say, it's 2 copies of 3 billion base pairs. In every cell in your body, there's about 2 meters of DNA. There's something like about 10 to the 14 cells in your body, so if you do the silly sums, there's about 200 billion kilometers of DNA in your body, and that's enough to get to the sun and back 500 times. In terms of your body mass, assuming you're an average-sized person, it's about 1% of your body weight is your DNA. It is coded. Each of the triplets, each of those 3 of those letters codes for a particular amino acid that goes then combining those together to make a protein, and there's a code that does that. People might debate as to where the code comes from. It's degenerate. There are some things, these are amino acid, that's proline, that's leucine, serine, and you can see that some of these amino acids are coded for by more than one of those triplets. So there's scope for error to come in. There can be mutations that still are viable. Why is that genetic code chosen? Well, it could be it's the optimal one. It could be it's the only one that ever evolved, that ever appeared. We don't know. DNA itself does nothing, but it codes for everything. It is the repository for our genetic makeup. DNA makes RNA, makes protein, is the classic bit of molecular biology, the dogma of molecular biology. And those proteins then go to making us up in terms of our metabolism, our structure, the organization, and our development. Great strides in the whole area were achieved as a result of the sequencing of the human genome. The cost, I can't remember what it was astronomical, the cost of sequencing the first human genome, billions of dollars, done just around the turn of the century. And here we have Bill Clinton, who was president of the US at the time, and Francis Collins, who was presently director of the NIH and a committed Christian at the time, was director of the Human Genome Project. And they bring the God word even into there. Today we are learning the language in which God created life. We're gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. And when that was sequenced, there were some surprises. And one of the surprises in that was that actually if you count up how many genes we've got, it's probably only about 20,000. If you look at literature going back only maybe 10 years before, it was estimated it was probably about 200,000. Because obviously we must have more genes than a fruit fly or a worm or something like that. But actually, it turns out we've got roughly the same number of genes as there are in a mouse or a worm. There are, however, ways in which those genes can be cut and spliced together to make lots of protein products. So our genes, as many organisms, are arranged with what are called introns and exons. And introns are useless. Right? We'd throw them away. They're made into bits of RNA and then cut out. So that if we combine the non-light blue bits in this, you can make a protein like that and throw the light blue ones away. But you can throw other things as well. We'll throw that slightly darker blue one away, or in this instance, we can throw the red one away. So the complexity of the genome is immense in the way in which genes can be cut and spliced to make a lot of different proteins. And actually a large number of genetic diseases result around incorrect splicing. And thalassemia is an example of that. Mutations in the splice site where it's cut produce that genetic condition. We know that most of our DNA does not code for proteins. Most of our DNA, well, if you look back in the older literature, was called junk DNA. And that is, please do not ever use that phrase now. I think it was a little bit of scientific hubris that said we don't know what it does, so it must be junk. We now know it is extremely important. Whether it's for control mechanisms or packaging, it is important, but we still don't know exactly what it does. It's like the biological equivalent of dark matter, I think. Except we can sequence it. And we know it's there. Our genomes are, though, the fossil records of what's gone on in the past. We've inherited them through generation past and past and past. And things have happened to our genomes over time, and they've got frozen within them. Bits of DNA get added into our genomes. Retroviruses, and HIV is an example of a retrovirus that gives a very serious illness, but there are plenty of other retroviruses that just get inserted. And they're non-pathogenic, you wouldn't even know they were there. And they get inserted randomly. In fact, our genomes are stuffed full of these repeated elements. Now, 8% in what we call endogenous retroviruses, 17% in these things called lines or signs. And they're not doing anything, at least most of them we think don't do anything. They're just a history of the past. And you can look and see what organisms have got them at which places in their genome. If it's there with us, but not monkeys, then that says that it's been inserted since the break between us and monkeys. If we got it in the same place for us and monkeys, then that was inserted further back. So you can start to construct evolutionary trees based on the genomics. There have been well over 1 million of these sorts of events, and by examining them and looking them in different organisms, you can see what, if you like, the phylogenetic tree is based on the DNA. And you find that some occur early in a lineage, some occur late. And there's, I think, I'm told about 7,000 have occurred since humans and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. And the remarkable thing is when you treat this molecular evidence and devise phylogenetic trees from that, it gives exactly the same pattern as the old-fashioned phylogenetic trees based on what an organism looked like. So there's very good evidence that this works. Our genomes are also stuffed full of things that are what I might call molecular fossils. Genes that were useful in the past and are no longer of any use for us, but are still stuck there, sometimes in a corrupted form. They're called pseudogenes. Now, you know you should eat your 5 a day because you need the vitamin C. Many organisms can make their own vitamin C. No, we can't. Along with some other organisms too, chimpanzees, hamsters, insects and fish can't. But many organisms can, and if you look back in our genetic material, you can find the corrupted version of the gene that would have made it. It's there, but it's degraded over time. Presumably at some stage, our ancestors in the dim and distant evolutionary past went through a vitamin C rich environment, lots of fruit. And therefore it didn't matter if they didn't make their own, they lost the ability to make it, it wasn't selected for, but the gene is still there, corrupted. There are plenty of other examples of that sort of thing as well. Our sense of smell is not particularly good compared to many other animals. Dogs, you know, particularly very good at smelling things. And if you look in our genomes, the genes for the receptors for smell and taste, many of them are still there, they're just corrupted and they don't work anymore. So those molecular fossils that stick within our DNA. Here's one of the ones I like comparing chromosomes within a chimpanzee and us. We have 2 copies of 23, chimpanzees have 2 copies of 24, and when you line the chromosomes up, what it looks as though is that we have chromosome 2, which in chimpanzees is split in 2. And when you look at the structure of a chromosome, what it has is the ends of some very special sequences called telomeres, and we know what makes those sequences. And the center, it's not a very imaginative name, it's called the centromere. And again, there are special sequences that do that. When you look at our chromosome 2, it's indeed got the telomeres. It's got a centromere which is not placed in the center, but that's beside the point for the moment. But it has things in there that resemble telomere sequences and centromere sequences. Again, corrupted, but it looks as though our chromosome 2 has arisen from the fusion of 2 other chromosomes. And you can look back in there for the evolutionary past. That's changes in the way in which genes are organized. Some people say, well, where do new genes come from? After all, evolution is the mutation and selection over time. Where do new ones come from? Well, gene duplication is extremely important, and that happens frequently. You've got a copy of a gene that works very nicely, and in the replication apparatus, it gets copied twice. And that gives you a real big bonus because you can hold one copy constant, you've still got the activity from it, and then you start mutating the other one. So you haven't lost any function, you're starting to play around with and gain new function until eventually you get a new gene. Sometimes 2 genes come together and fuse and give a brand new activity. Some genes are made in a modular sense and you can start to shuffle the contents of the genes. Occasionally we have examples, even within the past century, of brand new genes. An example of that is the gene nylonase was discovered. Nylon is a totally synthetic compound and there are not naturally enzymes out there for degrading it. But it was found adjacent to one of the factories making nylon, a bacterium was isolated that is able to degrade it. And when you look at that, the reference is there if you want to look it up. It's quite an old reference now. It's a change in a reading frame of a piece of DNA that changes the ways in which those triplets are read, that produces an enzyme now that has the activity to degrade that. So if we say that the evidence for evolution and change over time is indisputable, and I think it is. How have Christians responded? And one is just, let's forget about it. Let's live in a different world. And I'm sure it's apocryphal, but by all accounts, when the wife of the Bishop of Worcester heard of Darwin's theory, is reputed to have said, "My dear, let us hope it is not true, but if it is, let us pray it will not become generally known." And that's many people's response to it. Let's just bury our head and forget it's not there. But there are, I think, three extreme views of evolution, which I'm very, very quickly going to go over. Young Earth creationism, intelligent design, and theistic evolution. And just so there's beyond any shadow of a doubt, is that I'm subscribing to theistic evolution as being the way in which God made things. Here's the extreme example, and spot the typo. Evolution must be wrong, of course, because it says so in the very name. It's evolution. I actually had somebody try and persuade me of that in a conference once. So young Earth creationism says that the Earth and life on it was created somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. The Genesis account is taken literally 6 days of 24 hours. It's literally true. And there are a number of very well-funded organizations, particularly in the US, that propagate that sort of way of thinking. And that you will find phrases that they throw out that says, evolution is a theory in crisis. And what they've done sometimes is they pick up debates that scientists love to have, debating about the minutiae of a scientific phenomenon, of who's right and who's wrong. And because we happen to discuss and debate some of the smaller details, they therefore think that everything must be wrong, and it isn't a theory in crisis. It is not a theory in crisis. Yes, there are discussions between scientists as to exactly what the driver for evolution is. The substrate is clearly DNA, the gene, but is that selected at the level of the gene itself, or at the cells of the organisms, or even in the communities in which organisms live? So of course it's complicated. And here's a blog from, I think, a young Earth creationist that I respect quite a lot, because he basically says, as I have, evolution is not a theory in crisis. He goes on, listen to me very carefully. There is evidence for evolution, and evolution is an extremely successful scientific theory, but then goes on, that doesn't make it ultimately true. And he just chooses not to accept it. He doesn't have a better theory to replace it with, but because it clashes with his interpretation of Genesis, he therefore thinks it must be wrong, even though he doesn't have anything scientific to replace it. Intelligent design suggests that there are some things in nature that are too complicated to have arisen simply by evolutionary mechanisms. Irreducible complexity is a phrase. Again, it's a very popular thing in the US, I think becoming more popular in this country as well. And they bring out one or two examples of very complicated biological phenomenon, bacterial flagellum, blood clotting system, immune system, and say that it's too complicated to have evolved. But when you get to the molecular biologist and the geneticist and the genomics person and the biochemist, usually come up with an explanation that gives a plausible reason of how these things could have happened. Biology, after all, is very resourceful. It's like me doing DIY, is that I've never got the right tool, but I somehow have managed to get out in my back pocket something, a widget that just about does. And biology gets by all those things that we've talked about. I think idea is bad theology, because actually it stops scientific research. As soon as you say God did it by a special act, there's no room for the scientists to do things. It's a kind of God of the gaps. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think, put it like this, not talking about ID, but we are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants us to realize his presence not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved. We see awe and wonder in the things that we know, and this is therefore a God of the gaps, and it therefore assumes that there is a backdrop, if you like, non-designed creation, and that God is therefore only involved in part of the process. And do we really need the intricacies of a DNA sequencer to be able to find God, to know the intricacies of proteins? Theistic evolution says creation and evolution, and there's a very good book which I'm sure there are many copies on the bookstall, and if there aren't, we'll go and get some more from the Faraday, published by my colleague sat in the back there, Dennis Alexander, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? I'm sure, Dennis, you'll be prepared to sign copies, won't you? Well, that's secured my post for a few more years anyway. So it says evolution provides the mechanism by which creation happened, and the creator provides the meaning for what has happened. Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote an article in the American Biology Teacher in 1973, which has become somewhat famous. The title of the article was "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And Dobzhansky was an orthodox believer. So it's wrong to hold to creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I'm a creationist and an evolutionist. It's a process that began some 10 billion years ago. He might actually have the numbers a bit wrong there, and is still underway. And Francis Collins, who we've already mentioned, talks about if God used this process and gave us the chance to discover it, then it seems anachronistic, to say the least, that we would feel we have to defend him against his own scientific conclusions. God is the author of all truth. You can find him in the laboratory as well as in the cathedral. He's the God of the Bible. He's the God of the genome. He did it all. Now let's start to look at a few more details. The question is, are we descended from monkeys? I think that's one of the things why some people feel cautious about evolution, is they don't want to feel is that a monkey was their ancestor. I think some people would be more comfortable with thinking that there were aliens that could come to Earth than they would thinking that they're actually descended from other species. Actually, we're not descended from monkeys. Evolution teaches us that we and monkeys have a common ancestor that probably looked a bit more like a monkey than us. And that was probably about 6 million years ago. And there have been a number of intermediates down that line. And here's a diagram I found that gives some of those. That's Australopithecus, Paranthropus, lots of them. And again, the order of those will change almost from year to year as new fossil evidence is discovered. We believe that humankind started somewhere in Africa and then migrated out of that, maybe starting about 60,000 years ago. And the out of Africa hypothesis, I think, was first proposed by Darwin because other things, the great apes, are there, and maybe you'd expect our closest relatives to be where we arose. If you look in the genome, some things that people come up with are what's called mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Our mitochondria are inherited exclusively from our mother. So the males do not pass on mitochondria. So if you trace back the sequences of mitochondria and see the differences between different populations, that is only in the maternal line. And by a bit of fancy computing and some bits of approximations, say, oh, okay, when did that archetypal mitochondrial sequence converge on one individual? And it comes to about 150,000 years ago. You can do the same with the Y chromosome, which of course is exclusively male. You don't get that from your mothers, so it's passed from father to son to son to son. And do the same sort of thing, and it comes to about 150,000 years ago. So you've got Adam and you've got Eve. But be very careful. Adam and Eve never met, right, on that scale. And there were probably other humans around at the same time. Well, there were other humans around at the same time. I mean, it's rather like drawing a family tree. Here we have, let's assume these are tracing the mitochondrial sequence. The circles are ladies, the squares are gentlemen. So here we have a couple, and we're going to follow the red one through. And of course, it's only copied in the daughters, and it goes through, and at the bottom here, we only have red ones. Follow through the green one, a different mitochondrial sequence in a lady living at the same time. Follow through to that daughter here, to this one here. This daughter only has sons, so it's not passed on any further. It might come through here, but again, that daughter didn't have any progeny. So you can see that it's the same way as tracing any of your family trees. It gets extremely complicated, doesn't it? So they're not equated with Adam and Eve. What about human genes? Is there such a thing that makes us human? And actually, there are some differences, but the majority of the differences between us and chimpanzees at the genome level is at the level of how when genes are switched on and switched off. So that the shape of a chimpanzee's face bears some similarity to others, but it's a very sort of different structure. And that's because the genes that are involved in doing that are switched on and switched off at different rates to what they are in ours. It's rather like, I think, looking at an orchestra. It's just by looking at the orchestra, you will not be able to tell what piece of music they're playing. You won't know whether it's a Beethoven or a Bach or a Stockhausen. Well, maybe you might, for Stockhausen, think with you, some people don't like it. But it's a question of what instruments are being played at any particular time, not the nature of the orchestra. Here's a gene that is found in humans. It has a code number. It's not found in chimpanzees. And we know when it's expressed in other organisms, it causes greater invaginations in regions of the brain. And that, therefore, could be taken as being greater cerebral activity. So is that a particularly human gene? Well, actually, when you look at the Neanderthal genome, we'll come to that in a moment, you find that Neanderthals have got that as well. So is there anything? There are some genes that are different between us and Neanderthals. We know that there are other hominids. So originally from the fossil evidence, suggesting that Neanderthals and modern human lineages diverged about half a billion years ago, 500, get me millions and billions right, 500,000 years ago. Neanderthals lived between about 130 and 40,000 years ago, and that was based on the fossil evidence. Here's a Neanderthal skull, and here's a modern human skull, and particularly notice that extended brow ridge. Just as an aside, Neanderthals are named after the place the fossils were first discovered, which was the Neander Valley in Germany, discovered in 1856. And a fascinating thing I discovered is that the Neander Valley is named after Joachim Neander, who was a German Reformed Church theologian and a hymn writer, and wrote the hymn that's well known to many of you, I'm sure, Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of Creation. So whenever you're singing that, think about Neanderthals, won't you? What do we know about them? We know when they lived. We know they're largely in Europe and Southwest and Central Asia. We know about their brain size, and it's actually slightly larger than an average human brain size, but in terms of proportion to body mass, it's probably very similar. And we know that they evolved, to say, in Europe and Asia. We're now able to extract DNA from some of these ancient species and to sequence them, and we now know the sequence of the Neanderthal genome. The draft published first in 2000 and more in 2014, and that tells us also some things about their social structure. The first, and there are several Neanderthal genomes that have been sequenced now, but the first female somehow showed that it looked as though her parents were likely half-siblings, so there was considerable inbreeding, and the genetic line showed considerable evidence of other incestuous pairings as well. There were likely small communities of Neanderthals. But the shocking thing for many people is that something like 1 to 4% of our genome is related to the Neanderthal genome. That it looks as though we have, at some stages in our evolutionary past, there have been matings between Neanderthals and humans that have been passed down through our line. Interbreedings happening about 60,000 years ago. And as the Svante Pääbo, who sequenced the Neanderthal genome, described it, Neanderthals are not totally extinct. They live on in some of us. And what is interesting, and I think further weight to it, is that the Neanderthal DNA is there in Asians and Europeans, but it's not there in Africans. And that's because the Africans were the ones who stayed in Africa, and therefore didn't meet with the Neanderthals that were there in Europe and Western Asia. So there seems to be modern humans, Neanderthals, and from sequencing of another ancient piece of DNA, these things called denosovans, and there seems to have been some interbreeding between them all. It's interesting what the reaction of some white supremacists was to that. Whereas historically people have seen Neanderthals as being rather thick and brutish, is that the white supremacists claimed, well, the Americans and the Western Europeans have got more Neanderthal DNA, that makes us superior, doesn't it? You can get all sorts of nonsense, if you like, out of anything. But are humans special? We can trace our origins to other hominids. Right? So what does that say about our being made in the image of God? Clearly, it does not refer to our anatomy, our genetics, or our physiology. A very simple way, God is spirit, not flesh and blood. We are flesh and blood. So our physical form cannot itself exclusively define what it means to be made in the image of God. You could argue that evolution might have taken a different turn. Stephen Jay Gould said about the contingency of evolution. Rerun the tape of life and you'll get something different. Others might disagree with that. If it did, would the intelligent creatures that would have evolved instead of us, would they still have been made in God's image? You see, we're 98% similar to chimpanzees in terms of our genome. Does that mean that chimpanzees are 98% made in the image of God? Clearly, being made in the image of God is not equated with our genetic identity. People have had various ideas of what being made in the image of God means. Is it to do with our cognitive abilities, our reason, our rationality, our ability to do mathematics and language and laughter and emotions and all those sorts of things? What about other hominids? We don't know how rational they were. What about people with mental disabilities? Are they less made in the image of God? I think most people would say, most Christians would say, yes, they're very definitely made in the image of God. So I think our cognitive abilities themselves don't define us as humans. What about our spiritual capacities? Our capacity for relationship with God? That, for a Christian, is very, very important. A significant part, I think, of what being made in God's image is. But were Neanderthals made in God's image? Could they relate to God? We know they had some social structures. We know something about their art. Did they have a religious? Did they have any religions? One thing that's important in the scriptural view of being made in the image of God is all people are made in the image of God, not just the king or the ruler, as in many surrounding nations. We have about 1 in 1,000 of our base pairs are different between you and the person next to you. We're all genetically related. We are one species as humans. And we're all of us, made in the image of God. Is it something that God has delegated to humanity, irrespective of our ability to contribute to society? Others may well want to talk about that later on in the week, about our value as humans. Others will say that our image of God is to do with what God has commissioned us to do. So that in ancient cultures, the image was the statue that says, "This is my property, I'm in charge of this place." And are we commissioned as God's image in this place to say that we are in charge of this in the way that God wants us to be? We represent God on earth. And maybe that helps us to see some of the connections within our responsibility for looking after creation. We have to ask the question then, who was Adam and how did this happen? Or was it that it slowly developed over time and we slowly became more aware of God? That's one way of looking at things. So that we're, as modern humans, from about 200,000 years on, have developed those capacities. Was there a single Adam and Eve? Were they made by a divine act of creation? I think the evidence points that it probably wasn't that. And when were they? Were they selected from a group of individuals? Was it actually a group that were made in the image of God, that God endowed that to them? Was it all humankind all at once? Did God breathe his spirit into mankind at a fixed time? The cartoon says, look, let's work with what we've got, take a few more promising apes and add some extra memory. The Genesis stories we read it suggests they were Neolithic farmers living about 10,000 years ago. But is that just a picture language, or should we try to read anything sort of historical within that? We need to ask the question in terms of relation to the scriptures, what about death? Evolution implies there has been death and suffering for billions of years. Organisms come and organisms go. And not just organisms, but species come and species go. Here lies everyone. No? You can't escape it. I think Genesis 1 and 2 are actually silent on the issue of non-human death. Clearly, Adam was told, and Eve, the day that you eat of the fruit of the tree, you will die. But I think there's hints that even Adam, in the biblical narrative, was not immortal. And Genesis chapter 3, God says says, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. I think the implication being that he wouldn't have lived forever, and that death is part of the natural process of being human and being human made in the image of God. Very quickly in closing, how much more have I got here? You haven't flashed me the 2-minute one yet. Right, the prompt. Some people don't like evolution because it seems to be chance. And where does God fit in with a chance? Hugh mentioned Jack Monod's book, Chance and Necessity, in that pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution, says Jack Monod. Natural selection, after all, is a chance process. I think it was Hoyle who said that it's like a complex machine, like a Boeing 747, that can't originate by chance. That actually is a bad understanding of what evolution is. It doesn't assemble all the parts de novo. It's a stepwise process of going from the simple through to things that slowly get more complicated. Mutation, after all, is a chance process. By UV light, by oxygen, by water, all of those things damage DNA, and the enzymes that are involved in replicating DNA make mistakes, they duplicate things, they introduce errors. So mutation is a chance process, but natural selection is not. Natural selection picks from that random pool the best adapted ones for whatever environment it might be. And some people might say, therefore, evolution is not goal-oriented. The philosophers and the theologians might like to debate that, but I think the molecular biologists would say it just is. Does it leave room for God? Well, there are some who've said if chance exists, then there's no space for God. But there's others who say, well, actually, it's the most effective way of God being able to do anything. Arthur Peacock, one of the fathers of science and religion in this country, he says it's as if chance is the search radar of God, sweeping through all the possible targets available to its probing. Maybe chance is a necessary part of God's creation in which creatures are endowed with free will. And we use phrases that are loaded. When we hear the word random, we often understand that as mean uncaused or purposeless. And that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of random events that can have purpose in them as well. And some have said, well, if God doesn't use randomness, then why does it look like he does? Huh? It's not fair. And after all, the laws of probability on which randomness, they are still laws. It's not something that's outside of scientific explanation. And just in closing, as we look at, is everything totally random? Simon Conway Morris, who's here in Cambridge, a paleobiologist, has written this book, Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Cosmos, when he points out things in convergent evolution, how things like eyes and plenty of other anatomical features seem to have evolved numerous times independently. There's only a fixed number of ways of flying or of walking or of swimming or whatever it might be. And that convergent evolution, he says, therefore says that there's almost an inevitability in the evolutionary process because there is only parts of the landscape that can be occupied that says that humans, or at least something with intelligent life that can relate to its creator, that has a spiritual awareness, that has moral awareness, that is rational and conscious, would have evolved anyway, even if the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct. There's almost an inevitability in that sense to the evolutionary process. And at that stage, I think I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we've got hands waving for questions, and we've got the microphone. So you come down, please.
So, Professor, thank you for your talk. And I'm a physics student, and I also curious about the first chapter of the Genesis and want to think about how to solve that. And as a physics student, and I feel it's already very hard. And by your talk, I find out it's not just the first chapter is hard. And so I'm wondering, it's like, actually I just have a talk with Dr. Holder. We feel, Genesis can be interpreted, not just literature reading them. But right now it's like I feel there's more challenges. I'm not sure it's my misconception of the challenge or there is trouble. I mean, Adam and Eva, they never meet with each other. Is that possible? Do we really have a real Adam? I mean, do you believe there is Adam, and he?
I'll come clean with you, and I will say that I am, if you like, agnostic as to whether there was a real Adam and a real Eve, or whether it was a process. You're quite right. The process is very complicated. Understanding what Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and actually lots of the rest of the scriptures, it's hard work. And I'm going to deflect some things to Ernest Lucas, who's going to give the talk that follows me, as to how do we interpret those things that were written to people in the ancient Near East. As somebody, I think we had John Walton speaking to us last year, who said that the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us. And we need to get to understand that, is it was written to people in the ancient Near East, in their culture, and explaining things in the way that they would understand. And we need to be able to put ourselves into their shoes, and I think Ernest may pick up on this, to find out what did they understand by it, not to look at an ancient scripture with 21st century eyes. And sometimes that's hard work to do that, of saying how does that Genesis narrative really speak profound truths to us today, without speaking scientific truths in the way that we understand science. But you're right, it's hard work.
So from genetic way, are we having a point that we can say, from this point literature study and from this point interpretive study?
Sorry, say that again to make sure I haven't misunderstood you.
So from our studies in the genetics, can we have some ideas in the Genesis that, this point actually can be reading as the literature. This part maybe we should interpret it.
Okay, in terms of the scripture, all scripture has to be interpreted according to what the intention of the author and the hearer would have been. That's the further back in time you go, the more allegorical things become, the more mythical, and I use that in a technical sense, the harder the work is for that. Matching the genetic evidence, I presented you with some of that in the talk. The Bible doesn't talk genetics in that sense. How do we keep those two in tension? And there are ways in which I think actually the molecular biology is silent as to whether there was an individual Adam, or it was a group of people, or whether it was the whole of mankind at the same time. I think you can read those texts in a variety of different ways. The science doesn't drive you down any one particular line within that. So it's using, as I think Christians have done throughout the ages, of reading the scripture alongside nature. And sometimes nature will tell us we've been misreading scripture with good intentions, but those God is one and truth is one, and that those fit together. And sometimes we get the Bible wrong and the science right, and sometimes we get the science. And it's finding ways to say, have I misunderstood the science? Have I misread the scriptures? And fitting those together. And that can be hard work. Thank you. I think it's a really important question.
I see a couple of questions. Robin first.
Just a couple of comments, first of all. On Adam and Eve and the story of Adam and Eve, if we have Adam first, and God, seeing him as lonely, and decides to make Eve, if he's first with his reproductive equipment, I think he might have seen it as quite a long wait, at the very least, to find out actually what it's about.
Yes, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah.
And secondly, on Neanderthalis and the change to Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, am I not right in thinking that's a kind of a Cambrian leap type thing as well, in terms of the change? And did Neanderthalis have Broca's and Wernicke's area of the brain, which makes us distinctive as human beings for speech, symbolic speech? Did the Neanderthalis have that fully formed? Do you know?
I hesitate to answer that in terms of the genetics, so it's not after me, but the FOXP gene that is supposed to be concerned with speech, and maybe others who know more about that that are here, is there in Neanderthals. So it does seem as though Neanderthals probably had some ability for speech. They had communities, they had, I think, burial rites, they had art, and a lot of those things go with speech.
And final observation, I'm surprised at how often there isn't a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution, and macroevolutionists, species evolution, almost invariably use phenotypical changes, alleles, rather than gene mutation. And I think it's confusing not to teach children there's a difference between adaptation and genetic evolution.
I take issue with that, actually. That macroevolution is simply microevolution writ large. Microevolution is things that go on often within years to decades that we can observe. Macroevolution is something that goes on over eons of time. People would debate as to exactly what is a species. The boundaries between species often are not very clear. Not that there is a total continuum across the biological spectrum, but species, the technical term for a definition of a species is that two organisms that can't interbreed. Right? Now, in practice, that often isn't the case. The mule, for instance, is two species that have, they've produced a sterile offspring. But so species evolution is simply, I think, microevolution writ large. And where things end up in different environments, separated for long enough periods of time, that those differences become amplified, such that they then physiological, anatomical differences start to be imposed on top of that as well.
I would like to come back to the difference between humans and non-human species. We have the same digestive system, the same energy metabolism almost, cardiovascular system, even neurotransmitters as many species. And this is the reason why new drugs or medications are tested on animal models. They are encoded in the genes. If you subtract from your count all these genes who encode for this machinery in a way, how big is then the difference?
Very small. I mean, you're talking about fractions of a percent of the genome, right? Which is why I want to come back and say that it is not our genome that defines us as being made in the image of God.
Yeah. It still remains very small.
It is, yeah. The exact number I couldn't give, but it is small in terms of total numbers of genes that are different, and whether any of the other genes that are broadly speaking of the same architecture but slightly different point mutations that give other slight variations in functionality. But it is small.
Professor, My questions are twofold. So first is on the role of Neanderthals. So are we supposed to understand it as, well, you've clearly made a distinction between the modern human species and the Neanderthals. So are we supposed to understand them as one of the other animal species that God has created before the humans? So when you're talking about Adam and Eve, so they are not applicable.
That's
right.
correct, yes.
But still, there are a lot of discussions. We talk about the similarities between the Neanderthals and humans, and we seem to be talking as if it's still more of a human than animals. So I hope to hear more on that.
Yes,
and,
thank you.
So another question.
Can I take that one first?
Sure,
And then hold on
you.
the mic and I'll come back to you. I mean, we are animals. We're part of the animal kingdom, right? So be careful with that. Neanderthals were different for us. They're a different species. But on the other hand, that comes back to how do we define species? Because it does appear as there was some form of interbreeding between them was possible. The question I think we have to ask is that, and I don't have an answer, is to what was the Neanderthal status in terms of being made in the image of God? I think probably most people would say not, right? But how are we defining being made in the image of God? It is something that is gifted from God, then quite arguably they weren't. If it's an act of divine grace and gifting, then that is something that's specifically human. And I'm seeing Ernest nodding, so I'm relieved. But they were clearly there at the same time as humans, and we know that they could interbreed with humans. At least the genomic evidence suggests that they did. And there were probably other hominid forms around at the same time. So it says something about where we have arisen from and what our not so distant cousins were. Sorry, you still got the microphone. You had a second question. I may not have dealt with your first one.
I see. Thank you. So my next question is, so if the genetic evidences point to humans actually evolving from other species and we having such continuous development between species, and while the Genesis as the biblical literature, it says like that God created humans as if when we read the literature, it sounds as if he did it in one cue, and it doesn't seem to point to such continuous evolutionary development. So how should we interpret the Bible then? So should we consider it as a literature? So God wants us to understand it that way, but actually it didn't happen that way. So it becomes a fiction with a very good intention.
Okay, and I'm going to leave some of that to Ernest to answer without writing your talk for you. Again, it's what way is that literature meant to be read? Is it a scientific text, or is it written in the way in which they wrote history? There are some clues within that there were other humans or other human types around at the same time as Adam and Eve. Where did Adam and Eve's children get their partners from? Right? In the very early chapters of Genesis, there are other cities that are mentioned, and it's too soon to have for populations to have multiplied that fast to get cities being built with that. So there are hints within that. Now, I don't want to have any form of concordism in interpreting that, but even within that, it rather suggests that there are other things going on at the same time.
I admit it's not really a question, it's more a comment, but it might just possibly help. Something that's come through to me incredibly strongly over the last few talks is that whether we're thinking of astrophysical cosmology or ancient geology or quite recent biochemistry, the message seems to be that if we accept that God has created, he has at each level chosen to do so by an extremely lengthy, slow, methodical, and fantastically complex process. the alternative would have been flash bang wallop and it's all there, either in one step or in three, if we're thinking about three versions. And it just makes me wonder what is actually the more fantastic, amazing, devotionally mind-blowing and ultimately convincing explanation. Because for me, a trick that puts it all there in a nanosecond isn't actually as great as what I think the science is saying.
Yes, I mean, it's taking it out of context, but the psalmist said, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" And looked in the immensity of the cosmos, and now for us, the immensity of the processes by which we come here. You could say, well, we're just insignificant, aren't we? But you can look at it the other way around, is it took 13.8 billion years of cosmic design to get to the likes of you and I, made in the image of God, to relate to God. And God was prepared to wait that length of time just for you and me. And that maybe turns it up the other way. That says, this is very, very special. Thank you for that comment. Yeah.
It's a comment on your remark relating mutation and chance. So when you talked about mutation in the last part of your talk, you only mentioned copying errors, radiation damage. But earlier in your talk, you mentioned other processes by which the genome was rearranged, like transpositions and gene duplications. And I think many people think that this is far more useful for adapting organisms to new environments. And it is known that transpositions are particularly activated when there are selection pressures on organisms. This has been demonstrated in bacteria, in Drosophila, and I think in the meantime in other organisms. So it seems to me and to other people that mutations are not that blind, and the DNA has lots of tools to modify itself. So Jim Shapiro from Chicago University, he says it's unreasonable to think that those tools are not used in some way to adapt to new environments. So it's not that type of blind chance that we sometimes think of. It's some search in a somewhat better chosen subspace, search for solutions, and not just completely left to copying errors.
Thank you. Yeah, that's. I mean, I mentioned copying errors just as the way I went through. You're quite right. Genome rearrangements have been quite common. In fact, they seem to be the rule rather than the exception in the ways in which bits of DNA are just moved around the genome. There are not just gene duplications, but sometimes there are chromosomal duplications. In some organisms, whole genome amplification. The whole lot has been duplicated, and that particularly happens in plant species. So there are many, many more ways than just simple random mutations at one point or another, but shufflings of the whole thing around. And I think we're only beginning to start to grapple with the whole concept of genome organization, and which bits are where and how they're packaged, and does it matter whether a particular thing is on chromosome 2 or chromosome 3, or which genes are on which chromosome? We know which they are, but does it matter that things that are next? We just don't know, and it's just fantastically complicated and awe-inspiring and great to be able to research in. Thank you.
Okay, time for one final question here at the front.
Well, first, thank you. There are some behavioral features that, in a way, are embedded in the genes, right? Well, if our ancestors were naturally aggressive in order to survive, does that influence our freedom as Homo sapiens? And how does it relate with the fall? In what way?
Thank you. That was, yeah. There are behavioral things in our genomes, that our genes do in some way influence some things of our character and our behavior and maybe our aggression. I want to be very careful about whether those are deterministic or not, and I'm not going to write Dennis's talk for him, but I think Dennis maybe mentioning that in your talk on Thursday, of determinism and genetics as well. They clearly influence the way we are, but they don't determine it. The question of original sin, well, I hesitate as to how we map original sin onto this. That's not to say I don't believe it, but I'm hesitating as to how that quite maps on. Clearly, the Christian understanding is there was an act of rebellion against God. Whether that was an individual or a society, or it's just something inherent in our human nature that we do that, I would hesitate to put an authoritative stamp on that. The fact of the matter is that we know what original sin is in ourselves, right? Is that all of us are sinful. Where did that arise from historically? Well, I could say that it's not my fault that I'm sinful. I could blame it on my mum and my dad, couldn't I? Because they passed on the bad genes to me, and they can say, well, it's not their fault because they passed on their parents bad, and so on. Then it's not my fault. Right? But actually, any Christian will acknowledge that the sin that in me is my fault, and I am responsible for that. So that's why I hesitate to map on sin onto the genetics and the evolution and the genomics. But it's a really great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's great to finish with a hanging question, because it gives space for discussion and it gives space